Hello everybody, this is Unit 10.3. We're doing some Russia this morning. It is, for me, it is early on a Sunday morning, so I will try not to nod off in the middle of this podcast, but I have USA hockey on the television to try and distract me. Currently, the United States is beating Slovenia 2-0, or it might be Slovakia, I'm not completely sure which slow means but on the screen, but whatever. This is Russia, and just because we are not covering this section in class, it doesn't make it less important than, say, the Germany section or the France section this unit. Each section is created equally, I believe, for this unit, so make sure that you put a lot of time into creating the notes here, because the Russians are kind of important to this big story called AP Euro. So Russia out of the shadows. We're going to look at how Russia builds throughout the 19th century in this unit, how it starts to foster a slight middle class, and see what events kind of pushed it toward more conservative rule versus middle class dominance. I don't know what I'm saying. It's early Sunday morning, so let's go ahead and get started. And we start with the Crimean War. There it is, the Crimean War. It's from 1853 to 1856. So again, we're talking about 5 years after the revolutions of 1848, which, as we know, did not occur at all in Russia. Okay, Russia was too conservative. You did not see that at all in Russia. We're going to really be dealing with this part of Russia right here, the Crimean Peninsula. Just fun fact, Sochi, where the Olympics are being held, I believe is somewhere in this neck of the woods. So just a little frame of reference. But the arrow is pointing to the Crimean Peninsula. The fighting actually, or the cause for the war is going to be somewhere different. And this is one of those wars that is not important at all in terms of knowing what happened in the war, but knowing basically the causes and the results of it is what you need to focus on. So let's look at some of the causes of the Crimean War. Really, there was only one cause. Orthodox Christians, which Russian Orthodox Christians, it is kind of the cousin of the Catholic Church. Okay, the Christians who aren't Catholics, but they're like cousins of Catholics, the Orthodox branch of the church. Orthodox Christians were being persecuted in Palestine, which if you have a map, you know where Israel is today. That's basically where you're seeing it. It's known as the Holy Land, where Christ was on earth and did his ministry at. So that's kind of where we're talking about here. And traditionally, the Russians were the, quote, protectors of these Christians, because this is Ottoman Empire territory, and it's still a place where the Ottoman Empire is very strong. So it's a very Muslim dominated area. You have a lot of Islamic influence, which is hostile to Christianity, and the Christians were being persecuted there. So Nicholas I, who's our boy from the Decembrist Revolt, he's still the Tsar of Russia, he's going to send Russian troops to occupy the area to protect the Christians. Well, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, did not like the Russians sending their troops into their territory. I mean, I wouldn't either, likely. So the Turks declare war on Russia. So now we got a war between the Russians and the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we know anything about the Ottomans at this point, they are weaker. They are withdrawing into kind of their center in the Middle East and away from Europe. And we found out from the Greek Revolution back around 1829 that the West is not hesitant, the West meaning England, France, and those, they're not hesitant to help the Ottoman Empire go down, right? They helped Greece find their independence. So, let's see what happens. Oh, here we are. It is a surprise move. Hence the title of the slide. Britain and France actually joined the war to support the Ottoman Empire. Now, why would they want to do that? It's not religious differences, because Muslims and then the Russians are Orthodox Christians, so it's not that, right? So the reason is they did not want Russia moving in to the Ottomans' land, into their territory. They did not want the Russians occupying that area, as the Russians would then have trade advantages, and Russia, which has forever not been on a warm port, would need that area. So Britain and France are looking to not really help the Ottomans, but they're looking to hurt the Russians and make sure they don't expand. The war goes on for 3 years. It's very irrelevant what happens in it. Nicholas I actually dies. He croaks out. And then we have a new czar named Alexander II. He's going to end the war in 1856 for reasons I will list later. They then have a peace treaty. It's in Paris. Of course, that's where these things always are. That or Versailles. I don't know why, but that's just what they pick. So they have it at Paris, and Russia is the big loser. Okay, they were really the ones that pulled out of the war. They're the ones that instigated it by Nicholas I sending troops. So they're the big loser. In any territory that they have in the Middle East, they have to give up all rights to, which again is not something that's going to help it's going to help the Ottomans. It gets the Russians out, but Britain and France aren't going to go out of their way to help the Ottomans out. This is a war that, as we've read, is very unpopular in France. Napoleon III gets a lot of flack for getting France involved in this war, and that leads to other issues in France, as we've read about. The U.S. did they score? No. Hey, did y'all watch that U.S.-Russia hockey game? I sound really sports illiterate here. That was really good. It was like another Cold War or something. I don't know, history joke. Anyway, Russia's the big loser. Unpopular war in France. Ottomans are protected. Crimean War. There were a few other Crimean things going on that made the war unique. If you've ever heard of a gal named Florence Nightingale, she made her debut, if you will, in this war, in which she led a battalion of women, sounds terrifying, a battalion of women, out into the battlefield to attend sick, injured, and wounded army officers. And she would help the British especially, again, the British getting in the war to help the Ottomans. But she would go out and attend to them. And this is really the first time that you saw women taking such a direct role in active warfare. Yes, they would have in the past helped them on the side, right, in hospitals and whatnot. But here's the first time that you see women actually getting out onto the battlefield, which, is something to be noted. So women, check. Okay, it's a big thing. Second, this is really the first war which you saw active media coverage. These things right here, this little buggy, this is a photography van. And the photographers, which the camera had been developed about 15 years before this, the first, idea of a modern camera. Photographers would go out in their little buggies. They would take action of the battlefield, and then they go into the little buggy, a dark room, and they develop the pictures. It's a very cool process. But really, this is the first time that people back at home got a view of what war looked like. Up until this time, war was a very romantic idea. It was like, let's go out and fight for your country, nationalism and all that. But people now kind of seeing the war is not all it cracked up to be. On the battlefield, it's not a great place, and the media are trying to do that. So I don't know if Bill O'Reilly or Anderson Cooper or anybody was there, but their forefathers were, I guess, and you see media coverage. And then really the big thing, and this is going to be the topic for the rest of our podcast, is that this was all about what Russia was bad at. And Russia's a big place. And if you remember the map, this is being fought on the Crimean Peninsula. It's not exactly right by Moscow or St. Petersburg. So they had to, ship a lot of people and military items and supplies to that place, and it took a long time. And Russia realized, we don't have the infrastructure to be able to compete on a European scale. We've got to build our country up. And if we don't, we're going to be a second-rate country, and we're never going to be the power that we can be. So this war does, if anything, it opens up the Russian government's eyes, aka the Czars' eyes, and says, hey, we've got to improve our economy, our infrastructure, our railroads, our factories, or else we're going to be a big pile of steaming turd in the eastern part of Europe, if they aren't at this point, or at any point. Who knows? So, sorry for the weird color. This did not transfer well. Anyway, we're going to look now at 3 czars in the 19th century, one of which will actually be the last czar in Russian history. Dramatic pause. Okay, back to it. So, 3 czars, 19th century, 1 okay, 2 not so much. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here's Alexander II. He takes over from Nicholas I. And if you note, he took over in 1855, so as I said before, he's taking over in the middle of the Crimean War. And he's actually going to get Russia out of that war. While Nicholas really looked to expand Russia's power, Alexander is very cognizant of Russia's problems. For one, we don't have railroads. So in order to succeed and move goods from place to place and to have any sort of competency in a battle, we're going to have to move supplies around. So the big thing he does is trigger industrialization in the country, build factories, build railroads, be able to move things around. I also believe that serfdom had set Russia behind, that Russia was not a modern economy like England, France, and even what will be Germany at this point, because Russia's still got the serfdom problem. 90% of the Russians at this point in 1855 to 60 work in agriculture, which is fine, but when the rest of Europe is building factories and working in factories and building crap and all that, you really are going to have some problems. And then having serfdom can lead to peasant uprisings and poor output of agriculture and bad techniques, and then the lords exploit the serfs, and then everyone's not happy, and then the serfs can be thrown into the army for 25 years if they don't agree with what's going on. This is all bad stuff. And Alexander is wise enough to see it. So he's going to sign the Emancipation Act of 1861. Ironic, because that's the year that our Civil War starts, which is fought partly because of slavery. The Emancipation Act is going to free serfs from their bounds. Peasants are no longer dependent on the lord. They can be free to move and change occupations. This is awesome. Serfs have freedom. They could enter their own contracts and own property. Land could be given to peasants. They could control their own fate. It's all great, but in reality, it's not going to have the effect that Alexander or the peasants want. The boyars, who are your nobles, are still going to be able to control much of the land. They're still going to be able to control much of what's going on. So after the emancipation, a new kind of structure sets up. And instead of owning their own land and living by their own and living off the land and having their own thing, most peasants are going to either move or be collected into these things called mirs. No, not the space station, but highly regulated communes or communities in which the peasants really had to depend on one another to survive. And they're really tied to their land because they really cannot go it alone. They don't have the resources, they don't have the skills to be able to do their own thing. So they have to live in these mirs, which the nobles still sometimes have control over. But they cannot be individuals because they cannot go it alone, and really it's one of those things where you kind of have to depend on everyone else to survive. I don't know if that's a bad thing, but in terms of building up a liberal movement in Russia which supported individual rights and individual abilities, you really don't get that in the mirs. You also have zemstvos or zemstvos or zemstivos, or I don't know what. It's the Z word. These are local assemblies that administer or control local areas. So now we're getting a little, I guess, glimpse of regionalism or regional power where people can kind of run their own government. The U.S. almost scored again. I got distracted there. But anyway, so the zemstvos give a little bit of political participation and control to the local bodies of people. And this is going to be kind of a forerunner for Soviets, which are workers' councils, which will develop about 50 years from now. Alexander also, he also relaxed censorship. He liberalized education, so he took it away from the church, or the Orthodox Church. And he also triggered the discussion of a potential legislative body in Russia, okay, like a parliament or a Congress or a Reichstag in Germany. It's called the Duma, D-U-M-A, the Duma. We'll see if that... Oh, the U.S. just scored. Oh, that's awesome. USA. Okay, anyway. So, we're going to see whispers of this democratic movement in Russia. Now, as Alexander got older, he did a whole lot with building railroads. Actually, in between 1860 and 1880, railroad mileage grew from 1,250 miles in Russia to 15,500 this is really making Russia into a bigger country, but there were some problems. Alexander II started to become more conservative as he got older, which, you know, is not necessarily a bad thing, but what happened is that as he began to change the country more and more, he became a little more hesitant to do changes because he was fearful for his leadership. He knew that there were enemies out there. He knew that there were people that were against him, and he had a whole lot of enemies because of that, because of the changes he made. There was a populist movement that developed that wanted to get rid of all the industrial changes and go back to the agrarian way of life. That's not surprising. That kind of happened. It's kind of your Luddites, if you will. They really didn't want to go into an industrial society. You had the intelligentsia, which were intellectuals in Russia who thought that they should eventually take over, which is basically smart people rule everything, which I don't know, is that the way life is today? But this was like a club that would, you know, take over, and smart experts would rule Russia, which is ironic because that kind of eventually happens. But anyway, and you also had a movement called nihilism. And the nihilists were intellectuals. This is really exciting. They were intellectuals who thought that there's nothing out there except science, and we should destroy civilization and build it up from scratch. So just completely quit what we have and start over. Well, quitting would be getting rid of the Tsar, so Alexander was fearful. He also had enemies from, the U.S. scored again, 4-0. Suck on that, Slovenia. Apologies to my Slovenian listeners out there. Anyway, Alexander, as he's making changes, is also having to control, I guess, his Russian Empire. Now, it's not maybe the problem that the Austrians have in controlling their empire, but there's this place called Poland where you have Poles who want their own country. Doesn't exist in 1881. And these Poles want home rule. They want the ability to rule themselves. So one day, Alexander is out in his carriage, I believe in St. Petersburg, and radicals who are wanting Polish freedom and Polish independence build these bombs and pack them on the outside with snow because it snows in Russia. I don't know if you knew that. They get these snow bombs, and as his carriage, Alexander's carriage, is going by, they throw these snow grenades at Alexander's carriage, and they hit, as you can see from the picture, somewhere in this range. They hit their mark. I will also get some arrows. Oh, that's not good. Let me try and get this back. There we go. Let's just like move the earth. Try this again. Somewhere in this range, they hit the carriage and boom! Explosion. And Alexander is critically hurt. He was actually at the moment going to be planning a Duma, a legislative council, legislative body. So he was getting ready to make maybe even a more liberal change and do a lot of things, but Alexander is critically hurt in this blast. He is taken to his bed, his royal chambers, and all of his children are brought to him. And as he's lying on his deathbed, about to die, he tells his children that the people of Russia have betrayed him and they must be punished. Okay, the people of Russia have betrayed him, they must be punished. So there's his children, who are the next in line to become Tsar, and Alexander had made all these changes to slightly help the Russian people, and is saying that, hey, they betrayed me, they must be punished. This is 1881, so you can just imagine what our next Tsar is going to be like. His name is Alexander III. He is also known as Coach O'Buck. I think you can see it, because I do. And anyway, he is the most reactionary Tsar in the 19th century. Let me move. There we go. And perfect. And what do we know about reactionary? What does it mean? Basically conservative. Okay, what he's going to do, he's going to put down all movements to try to liberalize and nationalize Russia. It is not good news for the people who are wanting more individual freedoms. His phrase actually was autocracy, orthodoxy, and Russification. Now, what's Russification? That means that everyone in the Russian Empire, if you're Polish, if you're Georgian, if you're Kazakhstanian, if you're Siberian, it doesn't matter what you are, who you think you are, you have to act Russian. You have to adopt Russian customs. So basically, that's if the U.S. took over Mexico, and the United States government told all the Mexicans that they had to act like Americans. They had to speak English. They had to celebrate the 4th of July. They had to say America wherever they go. They have to enjoy Walker, Texas Ranger, and laugh at Larry the Cable Guy, which, personally, I cannot do. But anyway, that's what Russification is, trying to create a Russian empire culturally. He is not very liked for that. But one thing he is appreciated for is he triggers massive industrialization behind a guy named Count S.Y. Witt, or Witt, or Witty, or White. You take your pick. He is really going to continue this idea of building on to the railroads in Russia to increase their industrial power. For example, he constructs the Trans-Siberian Railway, which connects Moscow with Vladivostok, whatever it's called. 5,000-mile railroad from west to east across Siberia. That is one giant railroad. Okay? By 1900, Russia is fourth in steel production behind some place called the United States, Germany, and Britain. By 1900, Russia is exporting half of the world's refined petroleum. Russia is put on the gold standard to strengthen their government's finance. Unfortunately, all this industrialization is going to create some problems with working conditions. More on that later. You also see a rise of a very small Russian middle class. Very, very small compared to Western Europe. But now we are starting to see a middle class. And that's going to be important later as well. So, this is Alexander III. Another thing, though, about Alexander is that he encourages anti-Semitism and pogroms, or organized violence against Jews. Okay, whenever you see the word Semitism, right here, that refers to the Jewish people. So the Jews living in Russia come under horrible persecution under Alexander III's rule. And, I mean, Jews have been persecuted throughout European history, but it's going to start taking an amp up, if you will, as we enter this nationalist age. The Jews completely, culturally, ethnically, very, very different. So the Jews living in Russia, Russian Jews basically, are very, very much persecuted. Now, because of these organized means of violence, okay, because of the persecution against Jews. Jews were actually blamed for the assassination of Alexander II, the snow bombs. Probably didn't happen. Those were Poles who wanted home rule, but the Jews were blamed. There's a guy named Theodor Herzl. He creates a movement called Zionism, and it's the idea that Jews need to return to the Holy Land, that they need to go back home, back to where they started, back to the Middle East, where we see Israel today. Okay? FYI, until 1948, there is no country of Israel. So at this point, there is no country, there is no land, there is no country for the Jewish people to call their own. Herzl argues that the Jews will never escape persecution in Central and Eastern Europe. It will never happen. So if they stay in Central and Eastern Europe for years and years to come, they will be persecuted. And as we know later, you're going to see possible annihilation from the Holocaust. So, what's the solution? What could the Jews do to get a home? Well, Herzl is going to contact Ottoman leaders. He meets with the Sultan, but he does not get his land that he wants in Palestine. Britain actually, to their credit, comes up with an idea, and they tell the Jews, okay, Herzl and his Jewish Zionist movement, that we've got a land for you, we got somewhere you can settle. It's in present-day Uganda. So again, the British say you can have what will be Uganda. It's not Uganda at this point, but you can have the land that will be Uganda, and you can create a Jewish national state in the center of Africa. Well, okay, Herzl declines, as you can imagine. So this thing, and it's often called the Jewish question. Okay, what will be done with the Jews? Here's the first really, well, okay, it's right here. Here really is the first time where you see this question being asked on a broad scale. What's going to happen to the Jews? Where are they going to go? Are they going to be integrated into European life? Do they want to reclude them or seclude themselves? They're not going to go to Uganda. So what's going to happen? It's going to be a story we're going to follow as we continue on. Well, Alexander III dies in 1894, which leaves his son, Nicholas II, to become what will be the last Tsar in Russia. We don't know that yet, but he's going to be the last Tsar in Russia. He is not the most capable ruler, and we'll get more details on that later when we go into the Russian Revolution. But really the highlights of Nicholas II here, the anti-Semitism kind of cools off a little bit under him, but not really to a huge degree. The industrialization continues, and that's going to cause some problems. For one, you would think that all this industrialization would help Russia out if it ever got into a war. It does again in 1904. It loses badly to Japan. Now, we have not mentioned Japan in this class, but we are going to start to in the 20th century because Japan is starting to build as well and build into a powerful country, but they are considered by Europeans to be an inferior power. So losing to them in any sort of armed conflict would be very embarrassing. Well, that's what happens. Russia gets their tails kicked to Japan in this war, and the treaty is actually mediated in the United States, in New Hampshire of all places, by Theodore Roosevelt. It's called the Treaty of Portsmouth. But Russia is going to lose this war. So losing it leads to a strain on their economy. Even though they have a little more industrialization, it's not enough to offset the cost of the war. So this is going to lead to mass unrest, and the next year we have the Revolution of 1905. This is not a major revolution, but it's going to trigger a lot of unrest around the country. In particular, the lower middle class working type people. They're looking for more political, rights that their English and French working cousins have received many, many years past. And one day, they're going to go up to the Winter Palace, which is in St. Petersburg. It's the Royal Palace in St. Petersburg, in the snow. They are a peaceful demonstration. They want to start a dialogue with the Tsar, to start to discuss, maybe we can get some rights and things, and maybe you can extend some privileges to us. So they go up to the palace, peaceful demonstration. They're actually singing chorus hymns. They're actually singing hymns as they march. It's a very kumbaya thing. It's very nice. It's probably cold outside, but I'm sure they had coats. They go up to the Winter Palace. The Tsar is actually not in town. Nicholas II is out of town. They don't know that, but Nicholas's army is going to greet the working class. And here's what happens. They open fire. The working class is slaughtered. I think around 200,000 people had marched peacefully, and I believe around 1,000 are killed. So this leads to incredible unrest around the country. People are ticked off. They're like, what is going on? Our Tsar is trying to destroy us. They didn't know the Tsar was out of town. They thought the Tsar had given the order. So there's a huge uproar. Everybody's upset. Bloody Sunday. It's got a nice ring to it, I guess. So what happens? How does Nicholas quell the uprising? Well, he creates the Duma. And again, the Duma is akin to a Congress. Okay? He grants freedom of speech, assembly, press. However, the Tsar remains in full power, and he ends up dismissing the Duma when it gives him some trouble. So don't think that he has written a constitution or he has guaranteed rights of people. He just puts these things in place and says, okay, I'll do this, and then pulls them back as soon as it gives him trouble. So is this a new, kinder, gentler Russia that has been formed, where the Tsar is cute and cuddly, or is it still the terrifying bear that will rip your guts out? It's probably still the ripping the gut out bear. It's not the cute little thing right here. This is the Chicago Cubs right here. I mean, they're so cute. They lose every game they play. You're just like, aww. And the Tsar is not going to be that. The Tsar is going to be the New York Yankees. He's going to do what he wants. He's going to buy everything he wants. He gets everything he needs. He subjects it upon everyone else. The Yankees are terrible. The Tsar is terrible to his people. He retains full power. So keep that in mind as we go forward. We see a Russian society, though, in closing, that is changing a little bit slowly. Like it or not, the middle class is starting to see more and more influence. The working class is growing in number and influence, and the Tsar is on his guard. So the trends that we see is that even though C.Y. Witt was leading these changes, Russia is still going to have huge problems. It's going to have huge issues in terms of infrastructure. And gosh, it's such a big place. I mean, with little middle class to kind of trigger this economic growth, there's not going to be a lot of growth quickly. Now, after Bloody Sunday and after 1905, that revolution, Peter Stolpen leads a movement to give some rights to peasants where they can kind of control their own destiny a little more. But really, it's a drop in the bucket. And what you see now is Russia in a place where nobody's really happy. The liberals want more changes. The working class want more rights. Even the nobles don't have the abilities and the rights that they used to. So they're going to be upset as well. Nobody's happy. All really it takes now is another trigger point, another unhappy step. Because remember, the Russo-Japanese War triggered the revolution of 1905. So if we have another war that happens and there's more loss and there's more embarrassment, then maybe it will trigger another revolution. And if you know your history and you know your years, you know something big is on the horizon. There's a storm brewing in Europe by 1910. And the only way that that storm is going to be silenced is by a little warfare. And it's a little thing I like to call World War I. And during World War I, all of these deficiencies that Russia has are going to come to the forefront again, and this time the revolution is not going to be quelled by shooting some choir singers on a Bloody Sunday. So when we get to that point, the Russia we know and perhaps love is going to change forever. So that's 10.3, that's Russia. Again, big point, know the Czars, know the Crimean War, and understand the trends of industrialization and what changes in Russia and how it is usually not enough.